Hello and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival 2017. We're now 4 days into this 3-week online festival of ideas, and whether it's your first DIF session or you're a returning participant in the DIF community, today I think we're in for a real treat. We're joined by Sandy Spiker, who is a partner at IDEO and leading their learning design team. Todd Rose, who's author of End of Average and faculty member at Harvard Graduate School of Education, and Ulrik Christiansen, who is CEO at Area 9 Learning. Today we'll be discussing some big questions around automation, adaptation and personalisation, and what these terms mean in the context of learning. What adaptive learning tools actually exist today? What are some of the legitimate concerns about how these are being used in learning? And what is the vision for the future of learning using these tools, from hearing from these speakers who are joining us? So stay tuned to be part of the conversation, and do post your questions in the session page and also on Twitter. I'm joined here in the studio by my co-host and friend Zara Heinrich, who'll be working with me to put your questions to the speakers. So do make sure this is a global conversation with you, so we can plug in what you want to hear about from these speakers here today. You can always find out more about the speakers on the session page, but if you're live with us here online, then you probably already know who they are. So let's get started.
Thank you, Jules. Let's start by establishing some common language. What do we mean by automation? What do we mean when we describe learning technologies as adaptive or personalized? Todd, could you illuminate some of those terms for us?
Yeah, maybe I'll talk about sort of personalization and adaptation. So for me, to say something is personalized, it means that the systems are built with an authentic understanding of individuals. And that would include everything from flexible design, precise demands, and authentic choice for the learner. And that stands in contrast with more standardized systems where we've assumed people are more or less the same and the sequences of learning are the same. In a similar vein, I see adaptation as extending personalization into the sort of temporal domain, right? Like, so that you're focusing on what someone does next, and rather than soldering together one fixed sequence where no matter what you've done before, you're going to do the same thing next, we're going to take a deep understanding of who you are and where you're at to make a real decision about what you do next.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, that all sounds very nice in theory. What are the current possibilities that technology has? What's out there? Ulrik, I feel like you might be able to give us some answers to that.
Sure. So the concept of differentiating instruction is not new. That's decades old. But what is really important is what happens and how precisely can you do that. There is a concept in medicine, which is precision medicine, which actually nails it even more. It needs it more accurately, which is how do you assess every week or every month, and then you readjust based on that? Or are you able to readjust the interactions with learners every 30 seconds or so? And if you look at the best example we have out there, which is one-on-one tutoring with a good teacher, it's the 2 Sigma study made by Benjamin Bloom, where he showed that there was 2 standard deviations improvement if you use one-on-one tutoring over classroom education. And if we then study what do these expert tutors or teachers do, they ask a lot of questions. They constantly reorientate what they're doing with that learner. They constantly profile, where's the learner now? Now let me try to do something and see if it works. So it's a very methodical approach to precisely hit the needs of the individual. That's what we as humans are really good at. But the current education system with one teacher to many students does not necessarily allow for that. But there are multiple attempts out there, and also some very successful ones, that actually with a precision that gets pretty close to what human teachers are doing, are able to accomplish that. But it is also very important that it's primarily in the knowledge domain that we have the attempts to do it right now. So it's not on all the other very complex 21st century skills. We can come back to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of dig into that a little bit, because when we're looking at some of the feedback from educators around the use of these technologies, some of the concerns that I've picked up on is a kind of displacement that might happen for the educator, and I can see what you're describing in terms of this. How do we kind of scale that model of one-to-one mentoring that works so effectively? But then also, I'd be interested in your take on what is the role of the educator then within that system?
So the biggest misconception right now is that the primary purpose of these technologies is to substitute the teacher. That couldn't be more wrong. The most important role of the technologies is to leave more room for the teachers to do the things only teachers can do. So it's all the things that we're currently using teachers for that are getting in the way of the very sophisticated life skills and 21st century skills like collaboration, communication, creative thinking, and critical thinking. All these aspects that often teachers do not have the time to get to. That's where the technology approaches can help, getting through some of the more trivial things and free up time for these things that are absolutely critical for the future learner.
And that's really nice to think about the needs of the learner, but also the needs of the teacher or the educator in many ways. Sandy, I'd like to pass a question or pass this conversation to you, because you have expertise on human-centered design. So that's kind of your profession, to look at what is best for the student, what is best for the humans involved in a process. What are your hopes for personalized and adaptive learning technologies with that regard?
I would build off of what both of these two guys have just shared, I see the fears constantly that teachers have about technology being thought of as displacing them. I think we see that same fear in parents. I think we see that same fear with students. One of the things that I often ask people is to think about a really profound learning experience that you've had. And I've heard hundreds of people share that story with me, and never once has it been with a piece of learning software. Never once has anybody said, because of Oregon Trail, when I was in 4th grade, my life was changed, right? It's always about another person and the influence they had in opening you up to a new understanding. That could be a parent, that could be a teacher, that could be a friend, that could be a stranger. But learning is inherently social. And ideally, what technology is opening up for us is the ability to drive deeper into understanding and developing our own intuitions and imaginations. And what we find right now is there's sort of like some default thinking about technology, that what it is about is giving you the information, as if the information is really where the learning happens. But of course, the learning happens in that spark, the understanding of what to do with that information and making that information come alive. And ideally, what we're designing are technologies that help us facilitate that interaction even more deeply.
And it would be very. I'd certainly enjoy to hear some examples of where you've seen that done well. Any specific platforms or particular technologies that exist. And Sandy, maybe we start with you, but it'd be great to hear from the others as well.
Sure, I can start with one that's constantly on the headlines. Actually, I know Todd's working very closely with Summit Public Schools, but they've done an amazing job building a learning platform that isn't just about the content, isn't just about all of the standards, but about actually a set of goals, helping you identify your own goals and tracking toward them, and using the technology to help scaffold that dialogue between you and a guide, a mentor, a teacher. We've been doing some work also here at IDEO around helping high school students, in a way, sort of find their sense of purpose. And I don't mean that from like let's declare in one moment a kind of a grand vision of myself or what I was born to be, but actually really developing the muscle of reflecting on what your passions might even be, because they're so varied actually throughout our lives, but especially when we're in high school, as our kind of identities are forming separate from the environments around us. And that we can be kind of reflective on what are things that I'm interested in, and that technology can help not only track that for us, but offer up opportunities for us to learn more about those things. And through those micro-learning experiences, we can develop a deeper understanding of who we are and what we're about. And that can help us make bigger decisions about colleges or about career paths. And so ideally, this sort of amazing time that we're living in, where we can have so much different information fed to us, that actually these tools can help us both kind of reflect on ourselves, but also help change the dialogue we're having between us and other teachers or adults.
Yeah, thank you. I find that really resonates with me. Thanks, Sandy.
Sure.
Todd, Ulrich, is there any other examples you'd like to bring forward at this stage?
I'll just say, so I'll echo Sandy with Summit Platform. I think it's fantastic. I would also just argue that I actually think the technology exists. It's really not the barrier. It's the know-how and sort of what gets put into that technology. So I'll put Ulrich on the spot and say I think Area 9 has done some of the best work in actually inventing adaptive learning. But I think he'll probably agree it's not the technology itself, it's actually the smarts that go into it and how you think about individual learners.
So yeah, Todd is being way too nice there, but what is interesting about the adaptive technologies we work with for the last 10 years is that it's actually an indirect impact it has on this. That what we're trying to do is we're trying to shrink the amount of time and attention that is spent on the knowledge domain, so we can free up time to where our real passion lies, which is in how do we actually get to the 21st century skills. And there are two good examples that I would like to mention there. One of them is Character Lab, made by Carol Dweck's many-year apprentice, Angela Duckworth at the University of Penn. And Character Lab is working on measurement instruments to figure out where, how do we measure motivation? How do we get some yardsticks so that we can begin to be systematic about what we're doing and how we improve? It's very hard to run a 100-meter race unless you, and you want to figure out where people are, unless you compare them to each other. So these yardsticks are important. There is a similar one in personalized learning in Chicago, it's a national organization now called Leap Innovations, that I think is very worthwhile to take notice of, run by Phyllis Lockett. And I'm fortunate enough to work with both of them, and they're both trying to address this fundamental aspect of establishing yardsticks so that you can be systematic about measuring where are we on the much harder aspects of learning: motivation, critical thinking, personalization. In the meantime, the rest of us can work with trying to see if we can shrink the knowledge domain to not completely consume the attention span.
Thank you. We actually got a question in from Stephen through the Diff website that is linked a little bit to the mapping that you just mentioned. And Stephen asks, don't we need to be using idiosyncratic maps like those derived from personal construct theory? As mental models vary beyond simple cognitive styles, like intuitive and sensory categories, for example. Could you, first of all, maybe help me break down this question a little bit for viewers who might not be as informed as Stephen, but also could you say something about learning styles, because that is definitely something that is also debated, that people can be categorized into different learning styles.
So that's three different questions. Let me take it one by one.
Thanks.
So, but let's shoot a nuclear missile through the learning styles hypothesis. We've looked at hundreds of thousands of learners and looked for whether we could find small affinities towards a certain style or another. There are so many other confounders that there is no reason to spend more time on that. Much more important to be able to step by step figure out where that learner is instead of stereotyping them into auditory or visual learners. That's the same as saying that all brown-haired will be learning the same way. So the second part, which is an extremely important question, is does it work if we're trying to define a truth for how people learn? And Stephen clearly knows what he's talking about, because he's bringing up the most important argument, which is we need to build something that much more behave like biological organisms. So I'm a physician by training. I respect the complexity of biology very much. And still, what we're seeing is most of the cases where people build technology, they start in math, and then they say, let's start looking at a student, seeing if they can divide fractions. Oh, if they can't divide fractions, let's backtrack to dividing whole numbers. Meaning, we're trying to build a network of arrows saying these things are related in this way. So we have an engineering approach where we think that we can build an electrical diagram of how people should learn, and then we try to see if we can get students to adhere to that. Unfortunately, that doesn't work. Like, it would be so nice if it was not more simple, not more complex than that, but it is. So you have to build something that is much more like the biological behavior you're finding when viruses are mutating or human like species are evolving. The models need to be that complex. So he's absolutely right. It doesn't work with these we call them inference models. What is scary about them is that when they break, they are really, really silly and they generate demotivation. Whereas when biological models, as we worked with the last 10, 15 years, when they're inefficient, they just waste a little bit of time. And that's much better than telling a student or a physician or a teacher, you need to do this, and it's obviously wrong.
Thank you for that. Obviously, those online can see we're having a few visual interruptions with the speakers, but I think the audio is still strong, which is great. Kind of amusing that on this online festival of ideas, talking about technology used in education, we're experiencing some technology issues. But thanks for bearing with us on this. I just wanted to pick up on that point, Ulrich, because these biological systems are very often complex and adaptive systems, and there is a shift in thinking that's required to understand how complex systems function and how emergent behaviour comes out of them. And within the educational system, there's a question here from Mr. Biscuit through the Diff website. Of how do cutting edge ideas and educations filter through the education system, and if I can kind of expand on that a bit, because I think how do they filter through both in the kind of formal learning context of school and higher education, and then into more informal learning and professional learning. So how do they filter through, but then also kind of link to what you were just saying about this shift to learning systems becoming more biological in their nature. How do educators, how do we empower them to actually deal with that shift in complexity, when arguably a lot of them are at a kind of threshold in dealing with a lot of it's kind of crowd control, to be frank. So there's a few different pieces there. I don't know, Ulrich or Sandy, Todd, who wants to pick up on some of that?
Well, I mean, I can say a couple of things about, so from my perspective, how it filters through education. I think so often we try to do things in education and think that will solve the problem. I'm a big believer, given that the things Ulrich just talked about, which are absolutely true, are a profoundly different way of thinking of ourselves and each other. The current system we have is built on something very, very different. I actually think it requires a pretty profound shift in the way that the public in general is thinking, because I think it has to produce some sort of downward pressure on systems to create better outcomes. And I think that, so a lot of our work right now is in trying to generate that change in understanding, not just in education, but in the broader public, because we think it's really important.
Yeah, I can build on this a little bit with I think what Todd's saying is really powerful, that actually a lot of the influence of how new ideas move through the system actually come maybe not necessarily from our schools themselves, but from people using tools or having experiences in a consumer marketplace, and bringing those into learning environments, because of course school is not the only place you learn. But I would say that I counter to the way that people often talk about education. I think that ideas and education move surprisingly fast through the formal system. maybe exposure to them does, but the adoption of looks may be different than people expect. I think often we expect that things kind of get solved in one place and then just rolled out in the same way we might see in a consumer marketplace. But education has a really, our school systems are a very different type of marketplace. And a lot of that really comes through having teachers who are in tune with their students and what their students really care about and how they're learning and what's engaging them. And there's like a little a shift that you can start to see with how teachers, despite the load that they're managing all of the time, when they're in tune with their students, they're able to bring more of the tools and more of the passions into the curriculum that they are teaching. And that doesn't always look like 100% implementation of cutting edge ideas, but often a lot of that thinking comes into schools in kind of micro adaptations. And actually that's innovation within schools. We see teachers modifying things that they've seen in other places. And actually, maybe it operates a bit more like the biological systems that you're talking about, Ulrich, than we're acknowledging.
So I like to add to that as well, that I think Sandy is right, that in some cases it actually happens too fast. And it happens in a not controlled way. And I'd like to highlight the importance of learning science. Like we have a method of introducing a lot of these things, which is based on hearsay or whether it's a good idea, whether it feels like the right thing to do. Whereas if we were to build a particle accelerator, we would go to physicists who would tell us, what does it take based on theory to make this happen? You wouldn't try to build it for $100,000 because there is previous knowledge where it's like they cost billions to make and you need like half a country in terms of land mass to do it. But in education, it's a little bit like with football on Sunday, where all the best football coaches from our couches. And it's in many ways, people jump to implementing things in education just because when I went to school and I have experience going through school, therefore I'm an expert in education. And therefore, I think that some of the stuff that Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is doing now, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, driving and supporting organizations that are driving learning science, I think that is extremely important to much more systematically move towards better educational interventions and environments. Because it does go slow, but part of why it's going slow is also that some of the many attempts that are made in a less than structured or systematic way, scientific way.
And possibly we don't always know why certain things don't work and are maybe sometimes too quick to jump to a next idea. There's a question here from Philip that also came through the DIF website. Talking about disruption and talking about this festival as being the Disruptive Innovation Festival. So how are the new technologies that we are talking about disrupting the outdated system of education? And are there maybe good ways or desirable ways? And are there maybe ways that that are less desirable, that might not lead to the futures that you're hoping for?
Yeah, I'll say I think there's I'll tell you, I think there's two ways that this goes horribly wrong, actually, the disruption through the technology, at least two ways. The one is that because we're not realizing that the future is precision, like we're never going back to less precise systems if we can afford it. We're not realizing who are these systems being optimized around. And so you can imagine that these systems are being built for middle class, white kids in this country, for example, once again, and then you have whole groups of people for whom the system never worked, but now these hyper adaptive, hyper precise systems they're not built for them, right? And I think you'll actually exacerbate inequality that way at a scale that will just take your breath away.
Could you give an example, Todd? Like, in what way is an adaptation for personalization just, for me, in the very definition of personalization would be that it could be kind of adapting to anybody. And it's kind of less discriminatory in a way.
It should be, right? But that requires embedding the kind of things that Ulrich's been talking about into the very DNA of the system. But right now, because most people still have this old industrial mindset of average-based thinking, they can't differentiate between what Ulrich's talking about and what some slick salesperson is talking about when they're pitching a product. And so if we come in and serve up simplistic, technologies that have been optimized around a small group of people, then I think if I'm a disenfranchised person to begin with, I'd say I'd rather stick with the old system, because at least it's so cumbersome, I might be able to catch up. But so I think there's an inequality aspect there that we have to be careful about. But I'd say the second thing, which is actually even more sort of scary to me, is let's pretend we've actually done exactly what Ulrich says, and we built these systems and they know us so well, but we haven't taken the time to make sure that the students themselves have a deep, deep understanding of who they are. Yeah. Then we end up having systems that are more like manipulation than they are about empowerment. And so I think there's this combination of making sure diversity is built into the system as well as individuality, and then making sure that we're actually providing individual learners with the same kind of knowledge about themselves that allows them to make authentic choices.
I didn't see this up with Todd, but it's exactly the difference between with the example I used with the division of fractions. What if, in a translated sense, so most kids, no matter what background they have, they would have seen a fraction. But what we can see is that if you take dyslexic students, it's actually a problem the way they learn math, and some of it is around some of these conventions. So what if the problem with division of fraction is actually the concept of a horizontal line, not the concept of having parts of something to be distributed by parts of something else? So if you extrapolate that into all the other areas of education, Todd is exactly right, that if we have too strong preconceived notions about how things are related, we will end up with these systems that are too stereotypical.
I just want to build one thing onto that. I love what that these guys just said, and totally agree. And there's another layer that comes to mind about the risks of a lot of these technologies is again, I keep coming back to the human relationships. And in a lot of the work that we've done, we've really looked at the stress that parents feel around how much is changing for how their kids are learning. And parents always want the best for their children, but they often don't know what that looks like. But what they really want to make sure they maintain is that they know how to relate to their child. And as our schools are changing through technology and with different priorities, actually it's harder and harder for parents to help their kids with their homework, or it's harder and harder to even know what's happening in schools. And that creates a difficulty in the relationship between parents and kids. And that's the thing I think we have to really look out for, is as we can imagine so far out for how learning can be different, how do we catch up all the people around the learners to know how to continue to relate? We saw that, I think, pain point in the US over the last few years around some of the Common Core standards and how those turned into curriculum. And there was like a huge uprising around the Common Core math teaching strategies from parents, because it was different than the way they learned math. And because it was different, they didn't know how to help their kid. And that's a deeply painful feeling. And so there's a lot that we have to be thinking about as we're trying to make changes in education.
It's really nice because the audience is right with us here, and do keep your questions coming in, as we've just got 15 minutes left of the session. But Sandy, just building on that point you've just made, Ben Knoll has asked on Twitter, what are the technical challenges is actually not the main hard bit. Actually, the really difficult bit, it's the adaptive change for adults, schools, and the systems that is required. And I guess linked to your point there around parents and their relationship with students in school. So how do we pair technology with the support required to shift mindsets within the system? So how can we help bring people on this journey of really utilizing these tools in a meaningful way? Sandy, do you want to take that?
I mean, I can tell you that's just like a great question. I feel like that is like, in a way, the design question of our time, that as we're imagining all the technologies we can create, we have to make sure they're desirable. Otherwise, they'll be rejected. And if education is anything, it's resilient. And so we should recognize that resiliency has a lot of strength in it. so that we're not, as Ulrich mentioned earlier, we're not running too fast into some changes that we don't know if they're necessarily successful yet. That said, I'll tell you one of the questions I've been thinking a lot about that I'd be curious what Todd and Ulrich think about this is a lot of focus these days is going on designing learning systems, how, designing better schools, designing better tools. But one of the things I'm interested in is how are we designing systems that learn? So if we actually see the student at the center, how can our systems better understand who they're working with and how to best support them? And what if we invert the assumption that our technology isn't, all the tools that we're creating aren't just about helping the student get better at what we want them to get better at, but instead thinking about how would we redesign systems so that they're constantly learning from and with the people that are a part of it.
Todd, Ulrich, do you have any follow-up on that?
So we've done a lot of work in that field, and adaptive learning that does not do that and does not have that as a central part of it, I don't know, maybe that's just a fancy gadget, because it is absolutely necessary that these systems are extremely plastic and evolve with the learner basis. As an example, all the work we've done with McGraw-Hill over the last years, where I think McGraw-Hill Education has now built over 1,600 full courses on these platforms. Each and every one of them has shifted the mindset that you prepare everything before you release the product. You put some of the efforts in before you release the product, then you learn from how real learners are actually interacting with these learning environments, and then you adjust the content curation based on validated and observed needs with real students. So I think it's only part of it because there's a bigger aspect of what you're asking. But I think that the first part is to just do it inside the constraints of the current schools. But another comment to that is also that there is a big difference between lower school in one extreme and higher ed at the other, where in lower school, the parts where we can use technology is much less than it is in higher education, where we've not had the same implementation needs in higher education. I think the latest report from my former close friends and partner at McGraw-Hill Education is that they're getting close to 70% digital revenue in higher ed. And that is because a lot of these changes were made inside the current constructs of professors with classes and teachers, and technology were able to really help there straight away. It's a much bigger problem to get to that level and proportional impact if you look at lower school.
That's really good. I don't know, Todd, if you had anything to build on that before we move on. We've got a few more questions to cover here, but is there anything you wanted to add?
I would just say, so I think a lot about things from a systems dynamic standpoint and how you transform systems. And I think part of the thread of this conversation that I think is really important is sometimes you go slow to go fast. And in systems change, it often is about the coordination of parts rather than it is about driving one thing really fast. And so I think that one of the dangers that we'll all face in this is that as people catch on to the power of the technologies to do things we couldn't do before, there will be a demand to have more of it as fast as possible. And we've actually got to resist some of that. We've actually got to make sure that we actually have mindset change across stakeholders and that we actually are tying that to a broader understanding of what we're trying to accomplish, or else it actually can go pretty wrong.
Mm-hmm. You say that we need to have a broader understanding of what we are trying to accomplish, and in my kind of personal reading on systems dynamics and complexity, Donella Meadows says something very beautiful and simple in saying the purpose of a system defines its structure. And there's a comment here from Linda who says, well, in a world where assessing and defining averages has become an obsession, what we're talking about could put learning back into education. So it's very much looking at, well, if the obsession of the education system is assessment, is extrinsic motivation, then maybe these are the structures that we end up with. Jules and I had the joy of talking a little bit to you guys beforehand, and I was just wondering if you want to share your thoughts around kind of the bigger purpose of education. Why are we doing all of this?
So yeah, so I love that you're quoting Donella Meadows because she's one of my favorites of all time. And I think for me, the lessons from her work around how you change systems is that actually you change the goal of the system. That's like this like the next highest level lever you have, and above that is changing the mindset that gave rise to the goal in the first place, right? And so I think so much of our conversations around personalized learning are all about these mechanisms, and we're missing a conversation about the purpose. Like, what are we trying to accomplish in public education? Like, what is the goal? And I actually think that that if we expand that view of what we're trying to accomplish, and things like Ulrich talked about with like these broader 21st century skills, I think it actually gives a clear sense of why it is that we need to make the changes we're making. And if we keep fixated on standardized tests of knowledge and relative rank, I don't think we have a case to make for why we need to transform a system. I just don't.
I noted earlier you said, education can become a tool to reshape your life. And I think, with such a fast changing job market for people, there is this real growth in people trying to tap into education in order to find those meaningful pathways. And you were talking about what's actually incentivizing people to learn now. There was a question that came in that was, talking about actually a lot of people who are in learning environments don't actually aren't necessarily there to really learn. They're either there because they're effectively in a kind of childcare unit so their parents can go to work, or they're trying to get a certificate so that they can get a job. And so it would be interesting to just play on this before we close out, of how is the intrinsic motivation for learners changing now because of the nature of the economy.
There's an interesting study recently made that shows that less than 8% of all corporate executives put any commercial value on learning. But that is changing so rapidly, is our feeling. Like, we're seeing with solid reports coming out driven by fear for what happens with the fourth industrial revolution taking millions out of jobs. But finally, we have an agenda now in the corporate space for the first time in decades, which is what is the real implications of learning that works? Not just the learning where you have to sit there and take a certificate, and the only thing you're after is the sheet of paper or the three letters after your title. And that is a big, big shift. And if that is truly happening the way we feel it is, then I think that this discussion will be reframed over the next 5 years.
Sandy, anything from you on that?
Yeah, I've just spent a bunch of time in we're working with a school for kids with special needs, and I have to say the experience of talking with those kids and with their families is the first thing that came to mind when you asked this question, and I'm trying to put it into coherent words, but working with such an extreme population, you hear some of the purest feelings. And when we talked with a lot of families who were not sending their kids to school, this is work we're doing in Saudi Arabia, where the kids with special needs aren't mainstreamed in the same way that they might be in other countries. We talked with a lot of parents who are not able to send their kids to a private school. And the pain that parents really felt was about not being able to know what their kid wished for or felt, not being able to connect. And, I really have been thinking a lot about that as the basis for everything, that ability to connect. And the society and us as individuals are all intertwined. And as the world changes around us, our understanding of it and our desires in it change. And the intersection of that is that connection. And so I don't know, there's a thing I've been thinking a lot about the role of school to give us language and give us concepts so that we can connect our grand creative vision, or the kind of thoughts that we have emerging into a shared space and connect with people.
Talking about connection, we just got a question from Dinil through the Div website that fits us quite well, and I wonder whether it can encourage you to think a little bit more about this, Sandy. Is there a place for place-based, activity-based, and rich traditional knowledge in the digital personalized education age? So, in other words, is there a place for connecting with the here and the now?
I mean, I have to say, obviously, that's what I really believe, and it's hard for us to design any technology that's meant to have a person alone in a room with a device, right? So much of what we're doing, for instance, with the kids in Saudi Arabia, is a lot about how to connect them and their parents, and actually have everybody in the family learning together. And we look at the summit work that we mentioned earlier, and how much of that tool is in a way a scaffolding device for that dialogue that you can have about what each day reveals about your new understandings and your new ambitions. And I think about Minerva, who got all the attention for being this digital learning, future radical vision. What they're doing is it's actually super impressive from a very historic perspective. They're very Socratic about their learning method. When it happens online, people might even be sitting in the same room together, but they're making sure they see each other equally on the screen. And that happens in places around the world. They're prioritizing not just what you're doing in the computer, but what you're doing together in a place all together. And so I think there's exciting ways that we can use technology to connect better in person. But there are also ways that we can just learn to prioritize connection in person.
Thank you very much. We're coming to the end, and we've just got a couple of minutes left. So I'd love to just get some closing comments from each of you. And if I might just prompt Todd initially just on this, because linked to that previous point we were making, in your book you mentioned moving away from the kind of certificate model of courses more to kind of building stacks of credentials, and I wonder, in this kind of transition that we're describing here, as people start to move to informing their own learning and using education to reshape their lives, what that kind of stacking of credentials, where your thinking's at with that from the end of Average. Thanks, Todd.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's such a simple thing that's going to be hard to do for universities, frankly. It's the idea that you're going to just force everyone into a 4-year degree, regardless of whether it's French literature or microbiology. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And that if we actually try to credential in the smallest possible way and allow people to take from different places, so you can be at Harvard, but why should you have to be at Harvard for everything? If the best statistics learning is being done through Coursera, that should be fine and it should count. And as long as we have a way to actually accredit, I don't have any problem with that. And I think that the future is going to be whoever figures out how to make those stackable credentials viable. And I think it's probably not going to come from universities.
Thank you. Any other closing comments from yourself before we go to Sandy and Ulrich?
That's great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being with us. Sandy, do you want to just any kind of final reflections?
No, I think this is a great conversation, and I am so excited with how human-centered everybody's approach to this is in this dialogue, and it sounds to me like through the questions people are asking, that's a concern too. And so it's really, I think, important for us to remember that the future is in our hands to create it, and what technology maybe suggests today is not what it'll accomplish tomorrow. And so how we design to help people become better versions of themselves is a great guiding point for us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ulrich.
So I think this has been a great discussion. I think it's great that you guys are organizing it. I think very important, it's not technology against humans. It's technology with humans.
Yeah.
I think both the work that Sandy is doing and Todd is doing is critically important, that we can develop some of the wildest adaptive technologies in the world, that we do at scale with millions of learners on it. And it's still only worth the value of the time we free up for the teachers and the appreciation of what you can do with these new opportunities. So the fundamental appreciation that there is a need that Todd is working on is critically important. And there is no doubt that the user-centered design that Sandy and others have been pioneering is where we really will benefit from these things. I sometimes joke that being able to contract the amount of attention we have on knowledge may be the biggest breakthrough since we stopped spanking kids when they got their math wrong. But it's still primarily because what it will give us is an opportunity to actually get to the really important boundary, which is, again, the 4 C's from the 21st century skills: collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking. That's the goal, but the path to that goal is through jumping through these other hoops and making sure that we're not wasting the entire attention on knowledge. Having said that, the last comment would be, it would be kind of silly if we have physicians and nurses running around not knowing the Latin names for the bones in the body. Then we cannot have professionals speaking circus language. So there is a limit to how far back we can cut the knowledge domain. So we need to find more efficient ways to get through that in order to free up the space for the rest.
Thank you. I can only iterate that what all of you have said. It's been such a joy to have that conversation. I want to give a big shout out also to our audience for all the great comments and questions that you've contributed. That really has made the conversation come alive. And as you might know, the diff continues, of course, and talking about technology and what it can do for humans. At 7 p.m. GMT, we will have a session that's called What Impact Will Blockchain and Cryptocurrencies Have in Africa with Laura Stevens. So if you're around for that, do tune in. And you can also catch up on all the sessions that have been happening. So if you want to tell a friend about the session and the conversation we just had, do send them the link. They can catch up on it over a cup of tea whenever they need to. And one recommendation from us is to catch up on A Good Disruption, a talk and conversation by and with Martin Stukti.
But for now, thank you so much to Sandy, Todd and Ulrich for joining us for this session. It's been a real pleasure for Zara and I to be part of the conversation with you, our online audience. And do stay plugged in. We've got over 200 sessions run over the 3 weeks. And we very much want to continue the conversations with you and keep the ideas coming here at thinkdiff.co. But for now, thank you everyone for joining us. Over and out here from the Diff live studio.